Okay, just to confirm, we're recording. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. If you've been with us since the first panel, thank you for your patience. And we're really sorry that we're starting a little bit late. Thank you so much to Professor Tahira Naqvi for being so patient with us. I'm just going to do a quick introduction, and then please go ahead. If you would like to share screen, you're more than welcome to. So welcome everyone to our first keynote. Our first keynote speaker is Professor Tahira Naqvi. She is a translator, writer, and clinical professor in the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, where she teaches Urdu language and literature. And her keynote address will be titled Ismat Chughtai and the Mode of Unself-Conscious Feminism. Professor Naqvi has published 2 collections of short fiction in English, Attar of Roses and Other Stories of Pakistan, and Dying in a Strange Country. She has translated into English the works of Saadat Hasan Manto, Khatija Mastoor, Hajra Masroor, and the major works of Ismat Chughtai. And I do have to add that in the other panel we were just in, many people mentioned that they are able to teach Ismat Chughtai in Western universities because of Professor Naqvi's translations of Ismat Chughtai. So again, thank you very much.
That's great to hear.
Most recently, she published a translation of Chughtai's historical novel, Ek Qatra Khoon, titled One Drop of Blood, the Story of Karbala in English. She has also published a collection of translations of Urdu poems by the well-known Pakistani poet, Femida Riaz, titled The Body Torn and Other Poems by Femida Riaz. Once again, Professor Naqvi, thank you very much for joining us. I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Zahra, and thank you, Sheila, and the Tasavvur Collective for inviting me. And I have to admit that when I was asked for a title, I sort of spontaneously came up with this with the promise that I would later either change it or expand it. And for now, this would do. However, for various and sundry reasons, I was not able to do that. But then as I started thinking about what I had, I thought, well, you know, we've been talking about Ismat so much, and there's so much has been written about her and her relationship with feminist ideas, feminism, etc. And, you know, so why not take a completely different view of what I'm trying to say? So, so here it is, and I would love to, you know, get a feedback from all of you as to what you think this is and whether it's it makes sense or not. So I will begin my talk today by speaking first not about Ismat Chughtai, but her brother, Azim Beg Chughtai. It's a story that bears telling in order to bring us closer to an understanding of the topic of my talk, especially the use of the word feminist. I must take a step back to seek some answers. Azim Beg Chughtai was Ismat's older brother, third on the list of 10 siblings, while Ismat was number 9 and hence considerably younger than him. He died of TB in 1941 at the age of 43. We know Azim Beg primarily as we in Pakistan, for example, primarily as a humorist and satirist. And those of us who are old enough to remember the writer of the novella Shahzori, which became a popular TV series in 1974. Despite its comic storyline revolving around a weak husband who cannot stand up to his father and his wife who takes a stand against opposition from her in-laws, the story created for the first time on Pakistani TV the image of a strong, defiant Muslim woman. However, I want to go further back to the 1920s, when Azim Beg Chughtai was a young advocate in a law court in Marwar in undivided India. He had already been writing and had been published. But along with novellas and short stories, he was producing and publishing work dealing with the status of Muslim women in India. And this landed him in hot water with the elders of the Muslim society of the time, especially the Maulanas and the Mullahs. Fatwas were declared against him, and he was declared a non-Muslim. He actually had to take part in a reconversion event, which was actually laughable. But anyway, he did it to satisfy his critics and his family. So what did he write that was so offensive? Let's begin with one of the first texts, Tafweez, an astonishing dream. Tafweez ek hayratnak khwab, which, written in 1932, is a satire in which a young man dreams he is now playing the role of a woman and goes through a forced marriage and other forms of constraints and abuses Muslim women were facing and perhaps still face. The ending brings us to Tafweez-e-Talaq, an addendum to a nikahnama that gives Muslim women a legal right to divorce their husbands without foregoing their meher and without having to petition for divorce. His second work dealing with the emancipation of Muslim women was Islam and Parda, written in two parts, namely Quran and Parda and Hadith and Parda, written in 1932. Hadith and Parda begins with an announcement. I have already, quote, I have already announced, and I announce again, that I will award any man 500 rupees who will present a sound hadith in which Rasulullah has ordered that Muslim women should hide their faces from men whom they don't know or men who are strangers, na mehram, end quote. In these books, he questions the practices of face coverings for women and keeping them in the house. He made a distinction between head covering, modest attire, and locking up women, rendering them voiceless and nameless. He pointed out that his audience was not wealthy, who could afford all kinds of freedoms while still observing parda, but the middle-class women locked in cramped, airless quarters, which denied them fresh air, sunlight, and any means of socialization or any vocation. These texts have contained detailed references to the ayahs of the Quran and Hadith, so that anyone hoping to condemn the works would have to be a scholar of the Quran and Hadith. The third book that he wrote is called Raqso Surud. In this particular text, he uses extensive ahadith to show that singing, women singing, women listening to singing, women playing musical instruments and dancing is not something that the religion forbids. And of course, you know, there are extensive references to the Prophet and to the Imams and to, you know, later Ghazali, for example, gives references from him. So these works are really extensively researched works, and it's very important that we know what's in them, and they're not just to be dismissed, because everyone at that time was very much upset and very much disturbed by what they were saying. It was shaking the foundations of what was considered to be the norms for the good Muslim woman. His ideas regarding the status of women were not restricted to these particular texts. He brought his work home. Azim Beg told his young and somewhat timid wife to stop observing parda. So he comes in one day and he says, well, you're not going to observe parda. As a matter of fact, he was at his in-laws' house. And right in front of her family, he tells her that she no longer needs to observe parda. And of course, her family is shocked. Her brothers are shocked. Her father is shocked. And he says, well, if she's going to observe parda, she's not coming home with me. And then he turns to her and says, do you want to come home with me? And she says, timidly, yes. And he says, well, let's go then. And she does not put her burqa on. She just takes a chadar and quietly follows him out. Of course, you can imagine what happened later on. There was this terrible chaos and tumult in the Chughtai house. And between the fatwas against him and his books on women's rights, the parda situation with his wife and his family, it just created an atmosphere that was impossible to imagine. And he was condemned by family, but at the same time, the family sort of knew that this is what he was going to do and this is what he does. And so they weren't shocked per se, but they had sort of had to go along. So this is the backdrop against which our protagonist, Ismat Chughtai, is growing up. This is the man, this is the brother who is her mentor. Don't forget, he's quite a bit older than her. And in fact, there is a wonderful section in several of Ismat's essays. You know, she used to repeat things a lot, where they're traveling, and she's very young, of course, and they're traveling on the train, going to a wedding, the whole family. And he quietly calls her to one side and says, listen, hide your burqa in the bedroom. And at first she looks at him aghast and she's like, you know, Amma will kill me, because Amma, her mother, was always on a war path against poor Ismat and looking for an opportunity to, as in Ismat's words, wallop her and bash her. और हर वक्त उसको मारने के लिए तैयार रहती थी, whether she had done something particularly or not, but because she was so rebellious and naughty. So the poor girl was always, you know, the mother was always in search of her. And the minute she saw her, the brothers would be engaged. They would be given 2 paisas or an anna to go and fetch her so that the mother could give her a wallop or 2. So Ismat said, well, you know, Amma will kill me, and how can I do this? And he said, don't worry, I'll take the responsibility. And so the burqa was then rolled into the hidden in the bedroll. And then, of course, everyone is ready, and all the girls and women have their burqas on, and there is Ismat Chughtai with no burqa. And she's just standing there, and of course the mother is getting ready to bash her and beat her, and they're all yelling at her, and because they're going to miss the train. Of course, the burqa is not found, and Ismat has to travel without a burqa for the first time in her life. And of course, you know, this is what sort of, when you read these things, when you go back and read all this stuff, you sort of begin to understand what was happening with Ismat. So he also was her first, Azim Beg was also her first teacher in many other ways. He was guiding her reading. He was making her translate from English to Urdu, which he said was a very good exercise for writing. He was giving her instruction in Urdu and in Arabic, and he was, you know, he was teaching. I mean, he was her teacher, basically. He was her teacher. And she was actually a very good learner. She was a fast learner. And her writing began to reveal signs of his influence. And at one point, she wrote something which was objectionable according to the prevailing standards. And everybody started to get upset with her. He too then said, well, what is this you've written? And this is what she says to him at this point. Quote, yes, I was very willful. When I started writing like this, of course, the world came down hard. This is a small excerpt from an interview. But my family also censured and scolded me. My older brother, Azim Beg Chughtai, was shocked. Wonder of wonders. He said to me, what is this you're writing? People are pointing fingers. I said, why does that concern you? People complain about your work as well. You also write. So I also write. That's it. And, you know, you see the beginnings here of the Ismat that is to come later. She was also reading what Azim Beg was writing. His activism found a home in his fiction as well. So earlier I had mentioned these texts which had to do with religion and Muslim women's status. Now we come to his short stories. It would not be wrong to say that he was the first male writer of Urdu fiction who endowed his female characters a voice loud enough to be heard. He moved from funny and playful women like the mischievous wife in Sharir Biwi to the angry and vindictive protagonists of Koltar, the naive and foolish girl easily manipulated, or the deceiving, scheming, and clever woman in Kamzori. As there were also women in action, as in Chamki, riding camels in the Thar desert, and the compassionate woman, as in Mrs. Carley, who saves the life of the very man who's making her life hell. Then we come to this really interesting novel that he wrote, which is called simply Vampire. It was written in 1932. I have not read anything like that in Urdu, either by a man or by a woman. It presents a young Muslim woman's story as she is raped while stranded at a railway station and subsequently suffers the consequences of this vile and dreadful attack later on during the course of the narrative. Written in the first person from the woman's point of view, it seems to carry a foreshadowing of the fate of many of Ismat's heroines in the stories she was yet to write. Vampire shocks and disturbs, as does Lihaf on first reading. Ismat was asked repeatedly how she decided to write about women and their sexuality, their inner lives. And she doesn't make any reference to Vampire or to any of the other stories that her brother had written or Chamki. Instead, she says, my earlier stories were written within the four walls of the house. It is generally believed that men are the only ones capable of talking about lewd subjects. No, women also talk like that. Women have more time. In the afternoon, the women from the neighborhood would gather and we girls were told to take off. I would hide, and then she laughs here, under the bed or some other place and would somehow listen to their conversations. The subject of sex is very important for women who live in Parda and exist in a suffocating environment. They would talk a lot about sex. My story writing is a reflection of this stifling environment. I'm sort of moving towards Ismat from the position on her brother and showing you how it was the atmosphere and the environment that she was nurtured in and that she lived in and that became her first schooling was Azim Beg Chughtai and his work and his ideas. And she never talks about it in her work, in any of the essays. But when you read about Azim Beg, only then do you realize that, yes, she had imbibed from him a great deal. And what I'm trying to say actually is that she doesn't come to writing with a feminist agenda. She's not sitting there one fine morning and saying, well, I'm going to be writing about women today, and I'm going to start doing this. And I'm going to write this story, Lihaf, about such and such because. And so people have asked her about Lihaf. People talk to her about it and the notoriety that Lihaf gained. And she says in one of her interviews, quote, because of this afsana, I've always been misunderstood, as though I've never written anything else. I'm not just Lihaf. I'm also Kallu Dipti, Chauthi Ka Joda. I'm also Hindustan Chhod Do. So when I wrote this afsana, I first gave it to my bhabi. The year was 1942. She didn't say it was a bad afsana. Instead, she said, oh, this is the story of that woman. Then I had a 14-year-old girl read it. And she said, I don't get it at all, end quote. She further explains her mode of writing, her technique, so to speak, although she never mentions the word in talking about her work. Quote, whatever I saw from the point of view of a young girl, I narrated. Someone said, oh, this story is about lesbianism. That was not the case at all. Actually, I had written about a lonely woman's life, a woman who had all the amenities of life, but she was deprived of her husband's attention. I tried to describe the kind of mental anguish she was going through, end quote. The interviewer finally asks her, will you agree with me when I say that if the women more so than men, make a courageous effort to break off social constraints and shattered traditions, our society will undergo a change faster? She looks suspiciously at the interviewer for a few seconds, then smiles and says, quote, absolutely. Women have to fight on their own, seize their rights. Men will never want women to be free. And for this reason, we have to take on the responsibility of shattering these old traditions ourselves, end quote. As she responds, I hear Azim Beg's voice ringing out next to hers. I know that she was in partnership with him without knowing, quite unself-consciously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Naqvi, for that. I like how you ended on that unself-conscious note. It's really interesting, obviously, because those of us who work on Ismat Chughtai and have read your translations of her as well are obviously aware of her brother and aware of the influence that he was on her. But looking at it kind of with the comparisons that you've done of the things that he said about her writing and how she talks about his has been really, really interesting and enlightening. And I have so many questions to ask you. I will refrain from going first. To our audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can call upon you. And you're welcome to ask Professor Naqvi any questions you may have. I'm gonna wait for a second just to see if there's anyone who would like to, oh, there we go. Okay, we have some questions coming in. So Munazza would like to ask you, how do you rank Ismat Chughtai in terms of her dynamic attempt of writing or addressing the queer aspects in her works? Do you consider it another way to express suppression Muslim women had to suffer at that time?
Well, I mean, this is something that we talk about a lot when we discuss Lihaf. And she, as I just mentioned in my little talk here, that she herself mentions that she did not know that she was writing about lesbianism or women in love, and that was not her theme for her. And so sometimes people have accused her of being ingenuous and like, oh well, she knew what she was doing. But if we read all of the material that there is out there where she expresses ideas about Lihaf, she actually, this is not what I've just quoted, is very mild. She was very upset with Lihaf, the story itself, and she regretted having written it for the trouble that it brought her and the terrible things she had to go through. And she kept insisting all the time that this is what it was. It was about a lonely woman, a woman who was lonely and who sought friendship, and we've I don't know whether, I don't know whether we have time, but my colleague and I at NYU, we've done a new analysis of Lihaf, because the translation of Lihaf that is out there right now in the collection, The Quilt and Other Stories, is not mine. So recently, my colleague and I were teaching Lihaf in a class where they're studying, where they read literature and translation. So I decided to look at the original, the Lihaf in Urdu. And this was after many, many, many years, almost like 15 years or so. And I was aghast at the difference between the story in Urdu and what we had been teaching, the English text that we've been teaching. So I told my colleague, I said, look, I need to translate this now. I have translated it, but it wasn't included because it's a long story. It was already there and vagara, vagara. So anyway, I said, okay, I'm going to redo it. And when we redid it, we taught it again in class. And the responses that we got from the class, this is an NYU class called Modern South Asian Lit, was completely, was very different, not completely, very different from what we'd been getting almost like 3 or 4 years before that when we'd been teaching that translation. So translation is a difficult process, and it creates difficulties for the reader who is not familiar with the original language. And so to answer that question, again, I will say, Ismat didn't think she was addressing this particular issue. We as readers, and we have the prerogative as readers to read what we want into the text, beginning with and ending with our own frame of reference. However, Ismat herself, did not say that she had anything to do with this idea. She was looking at it in a completely different. I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Absolutely. And I think it does, because Munazza has just added that it is so vividly discussed, this whole conversation around Lihaf in the Crooked Line, Tahira Naqvi as well. And I thought it was really interesting that you brought up the translation issue, because when I used Lihaf in my thesis, because I work on the Progressive Writers Association, and when I used it, I ended up reading the Urdu version first. And then when I looked at the translation, because I think we're talking about the same one, I was also very surprised. And it was not your translation that I was talking about, so that makes sense now. So no, absolutely. And I'm really looking forward to reading yours when it's out.
Yeah, we're thinking of publishing it somewhere with an article, together, so that
absolutely. Sheila would like to ask you a question now, so
sure.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Naqvi. I am somebody who works on Ismat Chughtai's works as well, so this was very enriching for me. I'd sort of like to talk about what you mentioned, the incident in the train with Azim Beg Chughtai, and how he tells her to, hide your cap. And then she does that. And I read this sort of narration in Kagazi Pairahan, and there she says that when her mother finds out that she's lost her cap, then she hits her. And young Ismat says, I took those blows like laddus because I'd choose that over wearing the burqa any day. But from this incident, which starts off in the beginning, young Ismat sort of understanding, coming into her own with feminism, after years working in the education sector, working with other women, when she becomes the principal of a school, and her engagement with other women who are very different and in a lot of ways similar to her, later on, she also remarks that just because I gave up the burqa doesn't mean that is the only way of
emancipation.
Emancipating yourself. And with a lot of her students in her school, she used to say that I understand that you might not be able to do that which I have done, but there are other ways, and you must assert yourselves in ways within the restrictions. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the shift in a more inclusive feminism as we understand it.
Well, you're absolutely right. And nowhere in any of her short stories do we see that the burqa is presented as something that is a terribly evil thing and has to be got rid of. There are so many other things that are much more important that need to be got rid of, in her opinion. And so, and you're right in saying that this was something that she was able to do, and that all her life she was, and her whole life was one in which she, I will not call her rebellious. I will just say, and she says that over and over in her interviews, again and again, I just did what I wanted to do. If I wanted to do this, I did this. If I wanted to write this, I wrote this. I wanted to write a certain way and I wrote it. And I don't really care what people think. So I guess that's a sign of a rebel, where you don't care what people think. But I don't think that, but the parda itself, the idea of the parda is an imposition upon women's rights, women's sense of freedom. And so I think that she pursued that in a particular way in her work, in her stories, although the word parda or the idea of the parda itself doesn't become an invasive thought. I don't know if that was your question. I mean, I'm not sure. Sheila?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, because it's so interesting. As when you read her personal narratives, she's so against any imposition, and in this case sartorial imposition, but she never imposes it on anybody. Even her narrators, her fictional women, she doesn't impose. She's very sort of empathetic in that sense, in understanding that everyone coming from a different class and background has their different burden to bear, and she's very cognizant of that. So just thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Zara has now raised her hand, so she can go next, and then I will ask you a follow-up question as well.
Ji, Zara.
Thank you so much, Professor Naqvi. It's actually so wonderful to hear you, if not in person, almost the best we can get at this point, because so many of us have sort of our introduction. It's interesting, even though I was born into a North Indian Urdu-speaking family. My introduction to Ismat Chughtai was in English, and in my English literature class, like when I entered university, and I sort of engaged with Chughtai first off in translation. Which is one of the sort of anomalies of living in post-colonial India, particularly as a Muslim today, is how you engage with a lot of Urdu writers, and you kind of come across them first in translation a lot of the times. And I sort of, this kind of draws a little bit, the crux of your talk, and correct me if I'm wrong, that I've kind of gotten is kind of recognizing to me the interplay of gender relations in some ways as well between Ismat and her brother, in terms of how they both forged each other's understanding of feminism and patriarchy in some ways, and how it affected their own literary sort of production. I wasn't even aware of Chughtai's brother's work, so that's indeed quite an revelation to me. But for my master's thesis as well, I looked at Chughtai, but I sort of focused on, I don't work on her anymore, but I focused on Teri Lakir, and again, your translation of that was what I was going off of. And I was interested particularly, and sort of linking that also to your talk right now, because it kind of reminded me, was the relationship that that Chaman had with a white man in the second half of the novel. I think he was called Ronnie or Ronald or something, or maybe I'm getting this wrong. Ronnie,
Yeah.
yes. And I've been interested in how Chughtai kind of, a lot of her, of course, there's most famously with Lihaf, it's about sort of women relationships and all of that, but also particularly how she visualizes man-woman relationships, or the navigation of sort of a compulsory heterosexuality, or a kind of heteronormative code within which these characters exist. And so I was wondering if how, in relation also to her brother, and possibly in terms of the male characters that this Muslim woman writer writes about, how do you see her engagements with the nuances of patriarchy and power emerging in the kind of male characters that she writes, sort of drawing for her from her own biographical sort of influences of her own brother, possibly? I'm sorry if this is a bit vague, but I hopefully you get the gist of what I'm trying to ask.
Well, I think you're curious as to why she chooses to create a character like Ronnie Taylor, right?
Yeah.
as the final choice for Ismat, for the narrator, for Shamman to marry. That's a question that we've all been asking ourselves, and nobody has ever asked her, because, you know, people actually, she worried about that. And critics used to say, well, why don't people write about you? Why don't they ask you questions about these things? But let me go back a little bit. I love going back a little bit before I can go forward. If you go through the list of the men that she was quote unquote in love with after she had finished being in love with women, remember, she had these very, very interesting relationships with the two young women in college, in the hostel, and which is a completely normal thing, and it happens all the time to all women, regardless of whether they are, you know, queer, or whether they are lesbian or whatever. I'm not very, you know, with this. So excuse my terminology if I'm not with it, but you know, or whichever way, it's all part of the system of growing up in a society which discourages the intermingling of the sexes. So we in South Asia grew up spending a lot of time with other women, other girls, when we were younger, with young girls, and older. So we form very strong relationships with members of the same sex, with other women, first young girls in school and then in college. And before we eventually, the world of men opens itself up to us one way or another. Either we go to a university, you know, where there are boys, or whether we are getting married and we are introduced, or whether we're looking at our cousins, you know, for Muslim women, and we find someone to fall in love with, etc. Before all that happens, there is that. And so I think Ismat is presenting a kind of an overview of the way a woman's life, the trajectory that it takes, so that she begins. Remember, she begins with the Anna, the attachment that she has to the Anna. So I'm just Zara going through the various loves of Shaman before I bring you to that final. Then she meets her friend's father. I find that one of the most interesting and moving narratives of a young girl being in love with an older man. And believe me, even now when I go back and read the Urdu, I feel as if I am Shaman, because I've experienced something like this. That is what made Tehri Lakir so important for me, because at every step, I felt as though I myself had gone through this, what Shaman was going through. And the descriptions and the feelings that she had for him, Rai Sahab, I think his name was. And so that, and then Iftikhar, the young revolutionary. And that too, I can identify with that very easily. And then she goes through this, you know, it's like a gamut. She goes through this whole, it's like a stage, that the various stages that she has to go through. And then at the end, and if you notice, the part about Ronnie is like, what, maybe 40 pages? And the rest of the novel is the rest of the novel. And so speculations, one speculation, she comes to the end of this novel, which is very autobiographical, and she doesn't know how to end it. Okay. 2, she decides, she's gone through everything, all kinds of different relationships. What is she going to do now? India is on the verge of independence. The white man is leaving. And so what does she do here? He's not left yet. Remember, this novel was written before partition. completed before partition. So what does she do? She introduces this white character, this Gora, this British person. And it's almost as though when you're reading that, when I'm reading it, or when I was reading it and translating it, I became Ismat. And I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to fall in love with this white guy? And I said, why not? Why not? Why shouldn't I be in love with this white guy? Just because he's white? And I've been there, done that, all of the other stuff. And so let me fall in love. So I'm quite happy with that. I hope I'm not shocking you guys. I hope we're just the four of us here.
Absolutely not. I was really enjoying this.
But so then I'm thinking, okay, let me fall in love. Let me create a relationship with this guy. Then suddenly, as a writer, she fails. She doesn't know what to do with it. Just as we didn't know what to do with partition, just as we didn't know what to do with independence. We were lost. She's lost with this white guy. And he doesn't provide her the kind of closure that she subconsciously perhaps is wishing for, whether in terms of this or whether in terms of what's happening around her. It's a very political novel if you look at it closely. And so what does she do? She takes him off and she becomes pregnant. And a lot of people are like, oh, you know, ye kya ho gaya? आखिर में वो माँ बन गई, you know, फिर वही बात हो गई कि इसमें क्या इतनी बड़ी बात हुई. और दुनिया इस्मत, ये जो इसका शम्मन का कैरेक्टर है, ये तो कि फेलियर हो गया कि you know, आओ मैं माँ बन गई और मेरे अंदर एक नई जिंदगी ने जन्म लिया. Well, the question arises, why not? Why not? What is wrong with being a mother? What is wrong with a woman thinking, well, wow, I'm going to be a mother? I don't know how many of you are married, but I'm certainly, you know, I've been there, done that. Gosh, I mean, I'm happy to be a mother. And so why not? So the thing is, we often become so caught up. We are so caught up with these established notions of how things have to be that we forget that there is, you know, the natural things aren't gone just because we're doing things differently. They're not gone. Women are strong and women are free and women are able to voice their concerns and they can do stuff and they're rebellious. But for God's sake, they still are women. We have you know, our biology and our bodies haven't changed. Neither has all of that comes with it. Everything is connected to the head, and we are mothers, whether we like it or not. And so why not include that also in this revolution that shaman is going through? And so by doing that, it's like, it's a whole, complete whole. And that is my explanation.
That's so fascinating. What an interesting insight into the ending of Tahira Naqvi as well.
Sorry, I'd just like to also mention that, yeah, first of all, fascinating ending. And I think this sort of nods to sort of one-track feminism, especially that was sort of cropping up during Ismat Chughtai's time. You know, she was seeing the rise of this, you know, Western feminism. And she was also reading, you know, counter arguments in sort of support of Islamic feminism or you know, counter feminism.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and
yes.
I think this ending just sort of shows that you don't. It's at least at the time it was not a weakness, even though people thought shaman, there's no way she should get pregnant, and it was considered maybe, you know, settling down, and that is a bad thing. But then she sort of reverted all of that with the ending.
Yeah, she also said, Ismat said many times that the most important thing in my life are my children, not my books. She said that many times. And of course, you know, she it's her prerogative if she wants to say that. and feel that. Why not? That's also part of being free, is what you want to, if you're feeling motherly, okay, you're feeling motherly. So who's going to stop you? I dare somebody to come and stop me. I would. Like, okay, you don't want me to feel motherly? Well, why not? Just because you're not feeling it means I shouldn't feel it. And therefore, I am not a free woman. No, thank you very much. Sorry, that isn't going to happen. So anyway, so I mean, you know, when you read Ismat, these are some of the things. And, you know, we've discussed the fact that it could have been drawn out further from the point of view of technique and the novel itself. Maybe the narrative could have been drawn out a little bit, maybe, you know, but also if she had drawn it out, perhaps like the partition of India, God knows what would have happened. You know, we couldn't draw, I mean, it hadn't drawn itself out. It just happened. It was a rupture. So this is also a rupture.
Thank you. That was actually a really fascinating response to my question. I was wondering, in the sibling relationships that sort of play out in her books, did you see sort of a whether it was Tahira Naqvi or others as well, did you see sort of a reflection of her own relationship with her brother, possibly sort of maybe being represented in her literary work? Was also one of the threads of my question that I was trying to tease out earlier. But sorry, I was a bit all over the place. But we managed to go to a wonderful place thanks to it. So thank you.
I'm going to.
Go ahead. Go ahead. No, just before I lose Zahra's question, I think what she's asking is, are her relationships with her brothers, especially with Azim Bey, revealed in her fiction? That's was your question?
Yes, yes. No, if it contributes to it.
No. She wrote one article, one thing about her brother, Azim Bey, and it was called Dozakhi. And the world has not forgiven her for that, for writing that. And it's a very, very interesting essay. It's a commemorative essay. She wrote it on his death anniversary, and she calls it Dozakhi, you know, a person who is condemned to hell. And I mean, you have to read it to understand what it was. And she explains that it came out of love, and it didn't come out of any kind of condemnation of him or his personality. But that was the way she, you know, wrote about things. But she mentions in her interviews, for example, by the way, I'm working on her interviews and letters right now, so that's why that's uppermost in my mind. She talks a lot about her brothers, and, you know, mostly how they teased her and how they made life hell for her, but also how, because of her brothers, she was able to exercise certain freedoms that she could not have otherwise done had they not been there. So they played a very important role in the way that what she became later on and how she wrote.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for your questions as well, Zahra, and thank you, Professor Naqvi, for answering it in such a great way. We actually have a few more questions coming in the chat, so I'm just going to ask one of these, and it actually links to a question I was going to perhaps quiz you on a little. So we have a question from Sirat Fatima, who says, I wanted to ask, how does one begin to avoid the borderline Orientalist or self-Orientalist trap of interpretation when it comes to female writers like Ismat Chughtai and stories like Lihaf? I am asking this because of Chughtai's own exasperation with the need for the audience to pigeonhole the story as just being an expression of a Muslim female sexuality. How do we interpret these narratives outside of the sensationalist notions of marginal subjects in academia? And the question I wanted to ask kind of draws from this, and maybe, you know, we can summarize everyone else's questions here as well, because I found it really interesting where you said I quoted you here, you said the words feminist agenda, and you said how she was getting frustrated with, you know, accusations like this. And I was wondering to what extent you think that this kind of very radical feminist, arguably Westernized feminism interpretation of Chughtai's writing and her style and her personality also has to do with the way that she's translated into English, because and this is something that Zara and Sheila and we've all mentioned, that we, come across Ismat Chughtai a lot of the times in English through English translations. So I was wondering what you thought about that. And I think that links to this idea of self-orientalist and that kind of trap you come into when you're analyzing her work, particularly Lihaf.
Yeah, well, translation is it problematic? I mean, as a translator, it's odd that I should be saying this, but I will admit that translation is a very tricky business. And I have had a lot of, not a lot, I have had many issues with my editor sometimes, who will want to smooth over the roughness that I like to maintain in translation in order to make it as literal as possible, so that it's not totally unreadable, but yet it appears as a translation. So there may, translation, hey, it's the whole business of schools of translation and various philosophies of translation. What do you do when you translate? Do you make it readable? Do you concentrate on the story? What do you do with all the imagery and the metaphors, etc.? Do you anglicize them? Do you try to translate them literally? Do you find some kind of a meaning and write that? So my philosophy has been relatively simple, and I've said this, off and on, that when I translate, I want my reader to know that what they're reading is a translation. This was not written in English originally. It's a translation. Hence, the reader has. So the other side is going to say, oh, the reader is going to be constantly thwarted by these kind of rough areas, and the reader is going to not be able to follow the story, and the poor reader. Well, in my opinion, there's no such thing as the poor reader. There is the intelligent, the aware, the alert reader, the reader who wants to know reader. So if that's not the case, then my translation isn't for that reader. So my translation is for someone who really wants to understand Ismat Chughtai. And how do I help with that? I help with that by creating by leaving in as much of Ismat's voice as I can. If I can't keep Ismat's voice in there, and there's some other kind of anglicized voice that's speaking English and telling Ismat's story, then as far as I'm concerned, it's a total failure. So there are things out there. There are people who are translating Ismat and the others in that fashion. And yes, people are going to use those texts. They're going to be quoted. People are going to write, all kinds of things based on those texts. And those texts are, in my opinion, the Orientalist version of what I'm trying to do. I'm constantly having this battle with my, with my editors, कि ये change कर लें, ये इसको ऐसे लिख लें, और वो यूं इधर वो noun इधर है तो verb इधर है नहीं, उसको ऐसे कर लें. For the purposes of smooth reading. So we want to pamper the reader. It's like everything else is happening these days, like everything should be easy. No, you can't do that. And with Ismat, you smooth Ismat over, you lose her, she's gone. So that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, I'm always trying. And so the idea is that Ismat's voice can only be retained if the Urdu-ness of the text is somehow maintained. The culture of Urdu is somehow maintained. And if you can do that, which is what happened in this story in Lehaf, I mean, fisty rubs and some other state thing like that was being used. I mean, I die before I use fisty rubs or some other thing like that. You know, we can't do that with Ismat. It's a joke. It's an insult to her Urdu. My goodness. I mean, as it is, you know, I call myself interlopers. We are interlopers into these texts. We are going in, you know, we are colonizers. I've used that word also in an article. We are colonizers. We go in, but we have to do it very, very carefully. We have to be vigilant. We are colonizing the text, definitely. But we have to be very careful about this whole business of how we do it. I hope that answers to some extent the question.
I think it does. It definitely addresses this kind of question I always have about translation and this idea of, you know, to make it accessible to a wider audience, you have to translate into English. But at the same time, there's always this fear of, you know, the typical things getting lost in translation or losing the essence, and the argument of trying to make it more palatable when you're putting it into English, pampering the reader. I feel like Ismat Chughtai herself would despise that idea of pampering her readers.
She said to me in a letter, I just finished translating it, the one and only letter that I ever got to her. And I had sent her my first story. And she said, translating from one language to another is always difficult. Those were बहुत मुश्किल, एक ज़बान को दूसरी ज़बान में डालना बहुत मुश्किल है. But if she said, but if you're satisfied. She didn't say, oh, I'm very satisfied with what you've sent me. But she said, if you're satisfied, that's fine. So yeah, so we're already doing, and you know, I recently have been reading Rumi. And so once again, the same thing happens there. You know, all of the Rumi that you and I have read, you and I who don't know any Farsi or Persian, we are not reading the real Rumi at all. But look how we've been drawn into this web of Orientalist Rumi, you know, where Rumi by Nicholson, Rumi by, what's that other guy who really massacred him, Coleman, and other people, yeah, and other people like that. Anytime, and this is my little advice to you girls, anytime you see rhyming in a translation of Urdu or Persian poetry, throw it away, discard it immediately. That's not the real thing. So this is what happens, you know, this is what was happening with Lehaf. And the teaching of Lehaf is a very good example of, and there are others too. I have read some horrible, really terrible translations of Lehaf. I mean, bordering on the risque and obscene, and with covers complete. And there are films, and she talks about that also in one of her interviews, of how her work is hijacked with these obscene covers. She talks about that in her letters. And she says that when somebody picks up an Ismat Chughtai novel and looks at this really horrible cover, you know, suggestive and obscene, and they'll be, ye aurat hi bahut wo thi. Fohush, the word is fohush. Ye to fohush hi likhti thi. We were not allowed to read Chughtai when we were children, when we were very young, generally, you know. So yeah, so there's a world of, you know, there's kind of all kinds of things that one has to be careful about. But I'm grateful that people are reading my translations, and I really appreciate that. That makes my day, as they say.
No, absolutely. We're getting a lot of messages as well talking about how the discussion of translation has been really interesting. And I think particularly, you know, using Lehaf as an example, it was just very timely. We actually had a couple of other panels where the story comes up constantly, and this issue of translation comes up, and this issue of interpretation comes up a lot, where again, with translation, you feel like what she's trying to say completely gets lost. So I feel like, this is a nice way to possibly sum up our day by talking about this.
We could do this forever. Maybe some other day we can all hang out.
Absolutely. We would love nothing more than to keep you here for another hour.
Please join us.
Favorite subject. I'm not doing anything. I've done my majalis of the day, and I'm the rest of the evening, so you can always get back to me. But let me tell you quickly one thing about Liaf. The thing that we discovered is that the story is not about the Begum and it's not about her servant. It's about the narrator's awakening to her own sexuality. And I'll end there.
Just incredible ending as well. Thank you very much, Professor Naqvi. Thank you to our audience as well. It was very lovely to have you. Thank you so much for responding to all our emails.
Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Naqvi.
Bahut shukriya, bahut mehrbani. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming. We have more panels and more keynotes lined up for this weekend. So please join us again.
Sure, I will do that.
Absolutely, please do. And we will see everyone tomorrow, where our first keynote to start the day is Professor Athar Zia, where we will talk about women writing Kashmir.
Wonderful. Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.